My daughter told me I wasn't welcome at her dinner because her husband didn't want me there. That was the day I decided she would never see another penny from me. I read the text 3 times, the words cutting deeper with each pass, as if repetition could dull the edge when all it did was twist the knife. There was no greeting, no softness, no father or dad. Just an announcement delivered like a bill due. You're not wanted. Stay away. He doesn't like you. I stared at the phone in my palm and felt the house go hollow around me. The kitchen clock ticking like a taunt, the kettle cooling untouched on the stove, the chair across from mine, empty the way it has been since the day my wife's laughter left this world. I had planned to put on the old suit she always liked, polish my shoes, carry a bottle of her favorite red, and a small toy for my granddaughter, something I'd wrapped in paper with too much tape because my hands shake when I try to be delicate. But the invitation I'd imagined was never real, and the door I pictured opening to warm light and family was just a wall I had painted myself to survive the quiet. My daughter's words didn't even carry the weight of her voice. They were cold pixels, a decision made somewhere else and dropped in my lap like refuse. He doesn't want you there. As though the man who married my daughter held the authority to decide how my blood should gather, as though the years I spent building her childhood, stitching holidays together when money was thin and grief was fat, counted for less than his comfort at a table I helped keep from wobbling. I felt the first wave of anger rise and then flatten into something harder, a sheet of ice spreading over open water. This will be the moment, I thought. Not with shouting, not with pleading, not with that familiar tremor in my voice that used to make me apologize for breathing too loud. This will be the moment I choose myself. The moment I honor the woman who told me to be steady and the promises I made at her bedside. I remembered the nights I worked overtime to cover tuition and rent they never saw. Remembered the mortgage overpayment that lowered their rate. The quiet deposits into accounts she forgot she'd given me access to when the baby came early and the heater failed. Remembered the text from months ago that asked if I could spot them just until Friday because daycare was due and the car needed tires, and I spotted them always because that's what fathers do when love is a verb and not a slogan. But love also has a spine, and mine straightened as I scrolled to the top of the thread and saw how many times I had said yes, while my own life narrowed to make room for their convenience. I put the phone down face first and breathed until the tremor left my hands. I said her name in my chest, the name of the woman who taught our daughter to say please and thank you, who told me kindness without boundaries breeds contempt. I pictured the dinner I once would have attended like a beggar at the back steps, ringing the bell for scraps of permission to exist, and then I pictured the life I could choose if I closed my wallet, closed my accounts, closed the gate I had left open despite the coyotes. You weren't invited, the message said, and for once I listened. I invited myself to a different future. I could feel the decision settle into my bones with the click of a lock. No announcements, no ultimatums, no performance. Just the quiet, final calculus of a man who has funded his own erasure and has decided to stop paying the bill. She may not know it yet, but that dinner will be the most expensive meal she has ever served. When I think about the years that came before that text, I see them in pieces, shards of effort, each one edged with love and exhaustion. I remember the day I became both father and mother in a single breath. The hospital room was too quiet after she was gone, the kind of silence that makes you want to scream just to prove you're still here. My daughter was only 9. She stood there in her too big cardigan, clutching her school bag, staring at the bed where her mother had been only hours before. That night I made her pancakes for dinner, because it was the only thing I knew how to cook that she'd eat without complaint, and I promised her, swore to her, that she would still have everything she needed. I don't think either of us understood what that promise would cost. The years that followed were a blur of alarm clocks ringing before dawn, cold coffee and travel mugs, and hands so cracked from work that holding a pen to sign her school forms felt like a task. I took every shift they offered me. Weekends, holidays, even double shifts that kept me out until she was asleep, just to keep the bills paid and her world intact. The only break I allowed myself was to sit at the kitchen table after midnight, watching her sleep on the couch with her homework open, too tired to make it to bed. I'd carry her to her room, tuck her in, and tell myself it was worth it. When she needed braces, I sold my fishing boat. When she wanted piano lessons, I worked nights at the warehouse. I sat in crowded gyms for every volleyball game, even when I'd been awake for 30 hours straight, because I knew her eyes would scan the bleachers for me. I paid for the summer camps, the school trips, the prom dress she swore she'd pay me back for but never did. Every milestone was bought with overtime hours and postponed needs of my own. College was the mountain I climbed for her. She wanted to go out of state, better school, better opportunities, and I said yes, without hesitation. I drained savings accounts, took out small loans in my name, and sent her money every month so she wouldn't have to work while studying. I remember mailing her care packages with snacks, gloves for the winter, little notes tucked inside telling her I was proud. I missed her graduation because the company scheduled me for a last-minute job, but she didn't see that as a failure. Back then, she knew I was doing it for her. When she got married, I paid for half the wedding. I didn't have to, but I wanted her to have a day that felt perfect. And when they bought their first house, I loaned them the down payment, though I never expected to see it returned. Over the years, my support became so ingrained in their lives that I doubt they ever thought about what it took from me. It was just there, steady as sunrise. Every step, every sacrifice I made because she was my daughter and I loved her. I thought love was enough to guarantee respect, to earn a place in her life no one could take away. I thought wrong. The shift was slow at first, so gradual that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. In the early months after she got married, my daughter still called me every other day, still sent photos of the house they were fixing up, still asked for my opinion on paint colors or where to plant the roses in the yard. But even then, there were moments, small, sharp ones, that hinted at what was coming. I remember the first time I noticed the change in her voice. We were talking about a trip I'd been planning to see them, and I heard muffled words in the background, her husband saying something I couldn't quite make out. She laughed, but it wasn't the warm laugh I knew. It was thinner, edged. Actually, Dad, maybe it's not the best time for a visit. We've got things going on. I told myself it was fine, that married life was busy. Still, it stung. Then came the little barbs disguised as jokes. At a family barbecue, she made a comment about my old-fashioned clothes, glancing at her husband as if seeking his approval before smirking. Another time, when I mentioned helping fix a leaky faucet, she said, "Don't worry about it, Dad. We'll hire someone who actually knows what they're doing." The words landed like pebbles, small enough to ignore in the moment, but collecting over time into something heavier. It wasn't just the comments, it was the growing pattern of absence. They started hosting dinners for friends and her in-laws without telling me until after the fact, mentioning them in passing like they were no big deal. "Oh, we had a few people over last night," she'd say casually, then change the subject before I could ask more. When I finally asked outright if I'd done something wrong, she laughed it off. "Don't be dramatic, Dad. You're just different from our crowd." And yet, the financial calls never stopped. If the mortgage was tight that month, she'd ring me. If the car needed repairs, my phone would buzz with her name. Sometimes it was framed as a loan, other times just help, but either way, I always said yes. I told myself I was doing it because she was my daughter, but deep down I knew I was also trying to keep a connection alive, a connection that was slowly fraying. Her husband's presence in these moments was telling. He rarely spoke to me directly, and when he did, it was with a politeness so thin it felt brittle. He'd thank me for the help, but his tone always made it sound like he was humoring an obligation, not accepting a gift. I could see the way she mirrored his body language when he was around. Arms crossed, head tilted just so, a faintly patronizing smile. Those early years of their marriage planted the seeds of distance. Snide remarks became normal. Invitations grew fewer, and the sense that I was an outsider in my own daughter's life settled in. I didn't want to believe it at the time, but looking back, I see now that she was slowly being pulled away, not by force, but by a steady drip of influence that made her see me not as her father, but as an accessory she could choose to leave behind. The text came through in the middle of the afternoon while I was sitting at the kitchen table going over some bills and thinking about what I might bring to the dinner I assumed I'd be attending. My phone buzzed once. Her name lit up the screen, and I smiled without thinking. That smile vanished the second I read the words. "You weren't invited to dinner. My husband doesn't want you there." No greeting, no explanation, no softness, just that. I stared at the screen, thinking I must have missed something, maybe a message before it that would soften the blow, but there was nothing. Just those 2 sentences sitting in my inbox like they belonged there. I read them again, slower this time, as if a careful reading might reveal a hidden meaning, but the meaning was as clear as it was brutal. "You are not welcome. You are not wanted." I felt my jaw tighten and my grip on the phone harden until my knuckles went white. My first instinct was to call her immediately, to ask what in God's name I had done to deserve such coldness. But I just sat there, the words replaying in my mind, each repetition heavier than the last. I imagined the dinner, her table set, laughter floating through the air, the clink of glasses, and me sitting here in the same chair I've been in since her mother passed, the same chair I've kept warm through every holiday and milestone. I thought about all the times I had been there for her, the bills I'd paid without hesitation, the vacations I'd helped fund, the emergencies I'd handled while they were off living their lives. And now, in a few seconds and less than 24 words, I was told to stay away. My eyes drifted back to the phone, hoping another message might appear. Something to say she didn't mean it, that she was sorry, but the screen stayed dark and still. The house around me felt colder, quieter, as if the air itself had changed. I turned the phone over in my hand, setting it down on the table like it might burn me if I held it any longer. My heart was pounding, but my mind was strangely still. The shock was giving way to something else, something heavier, denser. I didn't just feel excluded, I felt erased. And as I sat there, staring at the blank space where a different kind of message should have been, I realized this wasn't just about one dinner. This was about every choice she'd made to push me further to the edges of her life until, in her mind, I simply wasn't part of it anymore. That was the moment the first cold threads of resolve began to weave together inside me. I didn't respond to the text. I didn't ask for clarification or beg for an explanation. I simply let the silence grow because I knew, deep down, that whatever had just shifted between us was not something that could be undone with words. I stared at the phone for a long time before pressing call, each ring stretching out like a rope I wasn't sure I wanted to pull on, but I needed to hear her voice. Needed to know if she actually meant what she'd written. She answered on the fourth ring, her tone clipped, as if she'd been expecting this. "Dad, I figured you'd call." I went straight to it. "I just got your message. You're really telling me I can't come to dinner?" There was a pause, and I could hear faint noises in the background. Clinking dishes, muffled voices, the hum of a TV, life going on without me. "It's his house, Dad. His rules," she said, her voice flat, final. "He doesn't feel comfortable with you there, and I think we need to respect that." My grip on the phone tightened. Respect that? I'm your father. I've been there for you every day of your life. What exactly is it I'm supposed to have done that makes me unwelcome in my own daughter's home? She sighed. That impatient little sound she'd started using in recent years, the one that told me she was already done with the conversation. "This isn't about what you've done. It's about boundaries. We have them, and you need to respect them." I felt something hot rising in my chest, not just anger, but a deep hurt that seemed to reach all the way back to the day she was born. "Boundaries? You talk about boundaries like I've been barging into your life uninvited. The only thing I've ever done is show up when you asked, pay for the things you couldn't, and try to be a part of your family. And we appreciate that," she said, the words sounding as hollow as an empty room. "But this dinner isn't for you. It's just close friends, people he's comfortable with. I'm sorry if that hurts your feelings, but it's not personal." Not personal. The words echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. Being told I wasn't welcome in my daughter's home, being excluded from her table while I've helped pay for the roof over it, and she wanted me to believe it wasn't personal. I took a slow breath, forcing my voice to stay calm, even though my heart was pounding. "You might think it's not personal, but it feels that way to me." She didn't respond right away, just let the silence stretch before saying, "I have to go, Dad. We'll talk later, okay?" And then she was gone, the line dead, leaving me with the sound of my own breathing and a stillness that felt heavier than any argument. I set the phone down carefully, like it might shatter in my hand, and sat there staring at nothing. That conversation didn't just confirm the message, it drove it deeper. She wasn't just following his lead, she was defending it, and in that moment, I knew that whatever came next, I'd make sure it was on my terms. That night I couldn't settle, pacing the living room with the TV on mute and my mind running laps around the same question, how did we get here? I told myself to leave it alone, to let the air cool, but somewhere after 10 I found myself driving over to drop off a small gift I'd picked up for my granddaughter earlier in the week. I didn't plan to go inside, just leave it by the door, a quiet gesture to remind her I was still here. When I pulled up, the house was lit, laughter spilling faintly through the open window. I walked up the path slowly, the box under my arm, and that's when I heard her voice. She was on the phone, close enough to the window that every word came clear. "Yeah? He called me about it?" she was saying, her tone light, almost amused. "He's so clingy sometimes. I told him it's our house, our rules, but he just doesn't get it." A pause, then a laugh I didn't recognize, sharp and dismissive. "Oh, don't worry, he'll get over it. He always does. And besides, he'll keep paying for things anyway. He can't help himself." My chest tightened, the kind of pressure that feels like your ribs are being pulled inwards. I stood there, frozen on the dark path, listening to my own daughter reduce me to a walking wallet, a predictable fool she could count on no matter how she treated me. She laughed again, softer this time, and said, "Honestly, sometimes I think he needs to feel needed. It's pathetic, but whatever works." The words landed like a slap, each one sharper than the last. I didn't move, didn't interrupt, just let them settle in my bones where they could burn themselves into memory. It wasn't just the exclusion now. It was the contempt. She didn't see me as family anymore. I was a convenience, an endless resource she could tap into while giving as little as possible in return. I set the gift down on the porch, my hands steady despite the storm in my chest, and walked back to my car without knocking. Sitting behind the wheel, I stared at the house for a long moment, the warm light in the windows, the shadow of her moving past the curtains. I thought about all the years I'd given, all the sacrifices I'd made, and realized that in her mind, none of it mattered. She thought I'd never stop, that my love for her was a weakness she could exploit forever. That was the moment something inside me shifted for good. The last thread holding me to the hope that she'd come around finally snapped. I started the car, the engine rumbling in the quiet street, and drove away without looking back. She might think I'd always pay, but she was about to learn what it meant when the man holding the purse strings decided to close his hand. I sat in my chair long after I got home, the lamp casting a small circle of light over the coffee table, everything else in shadow. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, but my head was anything but still. I kept replaying her voice in my mind, the way she'd laughed when she called me clingy, the casual cruelty of saying I'd always pay anyway. It didn't sound like my daughter. It sounded like someone who'd been trained to see me as a utility, a background feature in her life that required no thought until it stopped working. I thought about her mother, about the day we buried her. She was only 9. Shivering in a black coat 2 sizes too big, holding my hand so tight her fingers went numb. That night, after everyone had gone, I sat her down in the kitchen and told her I'd never let her go without, that she'd always have me no matter what. I didn't just mean food on the table and a roof over her head. I meant love, support, someone to show up every time she needed it. And I'd kept that promise through everything. I worked myself into exhaustion to make sure she could go to every school trip, join every team, wear the things she was proud to wear. I gave up weekends to take her to tournaments, gave up vacations to pay for tuition. Every milestone in her life had my fingerprints on it, even if she didn't see them. I was there when she cried after her first heartbreak, when she called me from college saying she couldn't make rent, when she told me she wanted a wedding she couldn't afford. I didn't hesitate. I just found a way to make it happen. Not because I had to, but because that's what her mother would have wanted me to do. And now, after all of that, she talked about me like I was a nuisance, a burden, someone to be managed and kept at arm's length unless money was involved. The sting of that went deeper than I could have imagined. I realized then that I had mistaken habit for love. She was used to me being there, used to me saying yes, and in her mind, that meant I always would. I could feel the cold resolve start to take shape in me, the way ice forms over a still pond, silent, unyielding. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was done being taken for granted, done being the silent investor in a life that no longer had space for me. I thought about the promises I'd made to her mother. They weren't meant to be a blank check for disrespect. They were about making sure our daughter grew up safe, loved, and grounded. Somewhere along the way, she decided those things didn't include me. So now, I had a new promise to make, not to her, but to myself. I would stop funding my own erasure. I made the call the next morning, my voice steady as I asked Mrs. Lewis, my financial advisor of over a decade, if she had time for me that day. She'd always known me as a man who cared about long-term plans, retirement goals, steady investments, but I wasn't there for projections this time. When I sat down across from her in that quiet, glass-walled office, I slid a yellow notepad across the desk. On it, I'd scrawled every way I could remember helping my daughter and her husband financially over the past few years. I want to know the total, I said. Every dollar I've been putting into their life, all of it. She raised an eyebrow but didn't question me. Instead, she opened her laptop, pulled up my accounts, and started cross-referencing with the list. Line by line, we went through it. The mortgage help, those monthly transfers I'd been making since they bought the house, just until they got settled. That alone was a figure that made my jaw tighten. Utilities, electric, water, gas, quietly put on autopay under my name because they said it was easier that way. Vacations, plane tickets I'd booked for them to join me on trips, or in some cases, trips I paid for entirely, so they could have a break. Then there was the private school tuition for my grandchildren, a bill that arrived in my inbox every term and was paid without a second thought because I wanted them to have opportunities. Add to that the emergency costs, car repairs, medical bills, surprise expenses they couldn't cover, and the so-called loans that never found their way back to me. Mrs. Lewis was meticulous, clicking through statements, highlighting recurring payments, flagging withdrawals. I sat in silence as she read the numbers aloud, each one stacking on top of the last, until the sum began to look less like generosity and more like a second household I'd been single-handedly supporting. "Michael," she said finally, leaning back in her chair, "you've contributed more to their lifestyle in the last 3 years than most people earn in that time. If you cut this off tomorrow, they'd feel it immediately." I nodded slowly, the confirmation both satisfying and infuriating. Seeing it in black and white stripped away any lingering doubt. My daughter and her husband had built their comfort on the assumption that I'd always be there to carry part of the load. I wasn't just helping in emergencies. I was underwriting their entire way of life. Mrs. Lewis gave me a long look. "Do you want to start making changes?" I met her eyes, my voice calm but certain. "Yes, but not all at once. I want this done quietly. No warning, no discussion. I want them to wake up one day and feel the full weight of what I've been holding up for them." She nodded, already making notes. As I left her office, I felt lighter, not because the problem was solved, but because the truth was laid bare. I finally knew exactly what I was taking back. It started with curiosity, but the deeper I looked, the clearer the picture became. I didn't hire anyone this time. I didn't need to. All it took was quiet observation, a few careful conversations, and connecting dots I'd ignored before. I paid attention to what they bragged about, what they avoided talking about, and the timing of their requests for help. The pattern was obvious once I stopped giving them the benefit of the doubt. They weren't just using my money for emergencies. They were relying on it to maintain the life they wanted people to think they could afford. The house they lived in, the one they'd proudly shown off on social media, had a mortgage payment that was barely manageable even with both their incomes combined. Without the monthly transfers I'd been making, they'd be in the red before the month was halfway through. The cars they drove, hers a late model SUV, his a sporty import, were both leased. the payments covered indirectly by the help I provided for other bills. The vacations they took twice a year, those were padded by the extra cash I sent them for birthdays and holidays. Money they never spent on gifts but instead funneled into their trips. I even noticed the little tells her mentioning that the kid's school relied on timely tuition, his casual complaints about how expensive utilities had gotten. Every single one of those costs had my fingerprints on them. And it went further than just keeping their bills paid. They had built an image, dinners out at expensive restaurants, tickets to concerts and events, a steady stream of new clothes and gadgets that only worked because my money freed up theirs to be spent on appearances. Without that cushion, their lifestyle would collapse in weeks. I confirmed it quietly. A mutual acquaintance mentioned in passing that her husband had been turned down for a personal loan earlier this year. Another let slip that they'd been late on a credit card payment until a family member helped out. I didn't need to guess who that family member was. Every thread I pulled led back to the same truth. They were propped up by my support in ways they'd never admit. Without me, they'd struggle to cover even the basics, let alone keep up the image they'd cultivated. And yet, despite all this, they still had the audacity to treat me like an inconvenience, someone to be excluded at will. Standing in my kitchen, reviewing the notes I'd been making in a plain notebook, I felt something harden inside me. This wasn't just about hurt feelings anymore. This was about taking back control from people who thought they could use me without consequence. I closed the notebook, slid it into the drawer, and felt the decision settle. They'd been living in a house I built for them without laying a single brick. And soon, they'd see what happened when the foundation I'd provided was pulled out from under them. I moved quietly, making each change with the precision of a man dismantling a house from the inside while the occupants slept. The first step was the joint account, the one I'd opened years ago, so she could easily access funds in case of an emergency. I went to the bank in person, sat down with a representative, and closed it outright. The balance was transferred into my personal account, one with no shared access and no paper trail they could follow. I left the bank with the new debit card in my wallet and a faint satisfaction curling in my chest. Next were the automatic payments, utilities, mortgage supplements, tuition fees that had been quietly draining my accounts month after month without so much as a thank you. I logged in to each service one by one and removed my payment information. For the tuition, I notified the school's billing department that I would no longer be the responsible party, instructing them to send all future invoices directly to my daughter and her husband. The woman on the phone sounded surprised, but I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. Then came the property. Over the years, I'd acquired a few assets, a small vacation cabin, some land just outside town that I'd always intended to pass down to her. I contacted my lawyer and had every deed moved into a trust, one she had no access to and no legal claim over. While I was at it, I had him update my will again, tightening the language to make sure there were no loopholes. The trust would protect the property, the accounts would protect my cash, and both would ensure that any inheritance skipped straight past her to my grandchildren or designated charities. Each step was deliberate, calculated. I didn't announce any of it, didn't warn her, didn't so much as hint that the financial tide was about to turn. Outwardly, I remained the same, polite in texts, still answering calls when she rang, still listening to her casual complaints about money, as though I hadn't just severed every direct pipeline she had into my resources. The beauty of it was that nothing would change for her immediately. The bills wouldn't bounce until the next cycle. The mortgage wouldn't feel the gap until the payment date rolled around, and the absence of my emergency deposits wouldn't register until the next crisis arrived. By then, it would be too late for her to scramble, too late for her to fix what I had quietly unraveled. I kept everything documented: bank receipts, legal filings, updated account statements, stored neatly in a locked file cabinet in my office. If she ever tried to challenge what I'd done, I'd have every piece of paper ready. For years, I had built her safety net, knot by knot, so tightly she didn't even realize she was in it. Now I was cutting the ropes in silence. When the fall came, it would be sudden, complete, and entirely of her own making. I made sure every move I made was deliberate, every word carefully measured. If she noticed any difference in my tone or manner, the whole plan could unravel before I was ready for it to hit. So I put on the same face I'd worn for years, the father who was steady, reliable, always ready to help. I knew how to play that role well. When she called to ask about my week, I answered warmly, keeping my voice calm and friendly. I told her I'd been working in the yard, fixing up the shed, even repainting the fence. I asked about the kids, their sports games, their school projects. She gave me updates, laughing here and there, as if nothing had happened between us. I laughed too. I never brought up the dinner or the text, never let her think it was still on my mind, even though it burned quietly in the background of every thought I had. Over the next couple of weeks, I made sure to send the occasional message, just enough to keep the illusion alive. If she texted me a photo of the kids, I responded with something cheerful and simple. If she mentioned a minor expense, like a car repair or an upcoming trip, I gave her the same friendly acknowledgement I always had, but I didn't reach for my wallet. This was the key. I had to starve the habit without her noticing the food was gone. If I cut her off suddenly, she might scramble, find another way, maybe even take precautions. But if she thought the safety net was still there, she'd keep living exactly as she had been, right up until the moment the ground gave way. When I visited for Sunday coffee, I brought pastries for the kids, just like I always had. We sat in their kitchen while she talked about summer plans, her husband occasionally passing through, saying little to me as usual. I nodded, smiled, asked polite questions. I was the picture of the accommodating father, the one who'd drop everything if she asked. All the while, I knew that behind the scenes, the wires were being cut one by one. The mortgage top-up was gone. The utilities were now billed entirely to them. Tuition for the next term had been set to send invoices directly to their address, not mine. The emergency fund I'd once kept accessible to her was now closed and transferred to an account she couldn't touch. She had no idea. She didn't see the quiet work I was doing late at night, updating accounts, meeting with my lawyer, filing documents to lock everything down. I noticed little things during those visits. Packages on their porch, from expensive online stores, dinner reservations made at high-end restaurants, photos posted online of outings that didn't come cheap. They were still spending as if my support was flowing in the background. It made me certain I was right to move slowly, to let them carry on with no warning. The later the realization came, the more devastating it would be. Feigning normalcy was easy because I'd been doing it for years. I'd been masking hurt, swallowing pride, and pretending everything was fine just to keep the peace. The difference now was that I wasn't doing it for peace. I was doing it for impact. Every smile, every warm word, every casual conversation was another step toward the moment they'd find themselves at the edge of a cliff they didn't even know existed. And when they finally looked down, they'd understand exactly who had been holding them up all along, and that I'd already stepped away. It was during one of my routine meetings with Wallace, my lawyer, that the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. We were sitting in his office, the blinds drawn against the afternoon sun, a neat stack of folders between us. I'd been updating him on the progress. Accounts closed, payments stopped, trusts secured, when he leaned back in his chair and tapped his fingers on one of the old property files I'd brought in for safekeeping. "You know," he said slowly, "this mortgage arrangement you set up for them years ago, I think there's something here you'll want to see." He pulled out the original agreement from when I'd helped them buy the house. Back then, they couldn't qualify for the full amount on their own, so I'd stepped in as a guarantor and partial co-signer under the condition that I could pull my contribution if certain terms were broken. I'd written it up to protect myself, never thinking I'd actually use it. Wallace pointed to the section in question, the legal language dry and precise. "Clause 14B, he said. "If the relationship between you and the primary residence changes in a way that negatively affects ongoing cooperation, you're entitled to withdraw your financial support immediately with 30 days' notice to the lender. They'd have to cover the difference or face foreclosure proceedings." I sat there for a moment, staring at the page. It was almost poetic. The very safety net I'd woven for them contained the thread I could pull to unravel it entirely. "So I can cut it off now?" I asked. Wallace nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Not only can you, but the bank is legally bound to inform them in writing. And believe me, once that letter arrives, the panic will set in fast. I can have the paperwork ready by tomorrow." The idea settled over me like a final lock clicking into place. They'd been living in that house for years, never once acknowledging that my name and my money were the reason they could keep it. Without my contribution, their monthly payment would jump to a number they couldn't sustain, not with their spending habits and existing debt. I pictured my daughter opening that letter, the confusion turning to dread as she realized what it meant. The conversation she'd have with her husband when he understood that the home he'd kept me out of could slip away from him entirely. I signed the necessary forms right there in Wallace's office. Each stroke of the pen felt deliberate, controlled. This wasn't anger anymore. This was precision. Wallace gathered the papers and said he'd send them to the lender immediately, with instructions to issue the 30-day notice. As I walked out of his office into the crisp evening air, I felt the difference. This wasn't just pulling support. It was pulling the cornerstone of their stability. Everything else I'd done had been quiet, invisible. This would be the first tremor they could actually feel, and they'd have no idea it was just the beginning of the collapse. The first of the month came like any other, but I knew exactly what was about to happen. I woke early, brewed my coffee, and sat by the kitchen window while the morning light crept across the yard. Somewhere across town, my daughter and her husband would be opening their bank app to pay bills they'd assumed were covered. I imagined the moment the numbers wouldn't add up, the way their brows would furrow when the mortgage payment didn't process. That payment had always been a silent fixture, made possible by my contribution flowing quietly in the background. Without it, their account would choke on the amount, the bank's rejection notice landing like a stone in their inbox. By mid-morning, I'd heard from a mutual acquaintance that my son-in-law had been seen pacing in the driveway, phone to his ear, his voice sharp and low. I could guess the conversation, him calling the lender, being told the payment had bounced, being informed that unless the amount was covered immediately, they'd be charged penalties and reported for delinquency. I didn't need to hear it to know the tone. I'd been on the other side of those calls in my younger years, but I'd never been in that position because I refused to manage my own responsibilities. It didn't stop there. The utilities, now entirely in their name, were due on the same day. No automatic payment from me meant the power company would be sending their polite but firm notice of non-payment within hours. Water and gas would follow soon after. I could picture the thin envelopes stacking up on their kitchen counter, each one another small crack in the life they thought was unshakable. The biggest blow, though, would be the tuition. The private school had always been a point of pride for them, a way to signal their success to friends and colleagues. What they didn't tell anyone was that I'd been covering that bill term after term. Without my payment, the school's finance office would have sent a prompt and formal email advising that tuition was overdue, late fees would accrue, and the child's enrollment could be jeopardized if it wasn't resolved. I didn't want my grandchildren to suffer, but I knew the school would give them time to pay, time enough to let the reality sink in that their lifestyle depended on a man they'd decided was disposable. By noon, my phone lit up with a text from my daughter. "Dad, call me ASAP." I let it sit there, screen glowing for a moment before going dark again. I didn't delete it, but I didn't answer either. Not yet. This was the first shock, and I wanted it to land fully before I gave her the truth. For years, they'd lived as if my support was an endless spring they could drink from whenever they pleased. Now, on this first day of the month, they were finding out what happened when that spring ran dry. And I wasn't about to turn the tap back on. The ripple effect didn't take long. By the second week of the month, the cracks in their facade were wide enough for anyone to see. It started small, things that might have been brushed off if you weren't looking closely. A canceled dinner reservation at the upscale bistro they liked to frequent, their gym membership mysteriously on hold. Fewer photos of fancy meals or weekend trips showing up on her social media. But in their world, appearances were everything, and appearances were beginning to slip. I heard from a mutual friend, someone who didn't realize they were feeding me updates, that my son-in-law had been noticeably tense at work. His colleagues were starting to whisper after he'd been overheard arguing with someone on the phone about getting the payment in before they take action. They didn't know what it was about at first, but they didn't have to wait long to find out. The car went next. His prized import, the one he'd used to project success, was repossessed in full view of the neighborhood. A tow truck rolled up one crisp morning, parked right in front of their driveway, and hooked it without hesitation. Neighbors came out to see what was happening. A few pretended to be checking their mail. Others just stood on the sidewalk, watching. The driver handed him a clipboard to sign before driving off with the car, leaving him standing there in his driveway, red-faced and tight-lipped. By the end of the month, the whispers had turned into quiet conversations among their circle. Friends noticed they'd stopped inviting people over for dinner parties. The once pristine lawn was going untended, the flower beds overgrown. Their kids missed a few extracurricular events, activities that, until now, they'd never skipped. The truth was becoming impossible to hide. Even their social circle felt it. A couple they often vacationed with had to cancel their plans because my daughter and her husband needed to sort out some things at home. Those friends mentioned it to others, and just like that, the story began to spread. People didn't know the details, but they knew something was wrong. In their world, silence was as telling as any confession. The part that made me certain the humiliation was hitting home was a post she made online, a cheerful photo of their family at a public park, captioned with something about making memories that don't cost a thing. It was the kind of thing she'd never have posted before, not when she was so intent on showing off luxury. It wasn't just a shift in tone. It was a signal, whether she realized it or not, that the life they'd been curating for others to envy was gone. I didn't gloat publicly, didn't so much as hint to anyone that I had a hand in their sudden change of fortune. But I watched from a distance, as the image they'd spent years building unraveled in full view of the people whose approval they valued most. And I knew this was only the beginning of the lesson. She came without warning, slamming her car door so hard it echoed up the driveway. I saw her through the front window, walking fast, jaw set, eyes blazing. By the time I opened the door, she was already halfway up the steps. "How could you do this to us?" she snapped before I could even say hello. Her voice was sharp, almost breaking, but it wasn't grief. It was anger, the kind that comes when entitlement is denied. I stepped back, letting her in without a word, and she marched straight into the living room like she still owned the space. "The mortgage bounced, the utilities are past due, the kids' school is threatening to unenroll them. What the hell is going on, Dad?" She planted herself in the middle of the room, arms crossed tight, waiting for me to explain why her life was suddenly falling apart. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match her anger. I just walked over to my desk, opened the top drawer, and pulled out a thick, neatly organized folder. Without a word, I handed it to her. She looked down at it, confused, then back at me. "What is this?" "Every dollar I've paid on your behalf in the last 8 years, I said evenly. "Mortgage supplements, utility bills, tuition payments, vacations, emergency expenses, all of it." She hesitated, then opened the folder. Her eyes flicked across the first page, dates, amounts, account details, before she flipped to the next, then the next. The sound of paper turning was the only thing in the room. I didn't rush her. I let her absorb it, let the numbers sink in. When she finally looked up, her expression was a mix of disbelief and defensiveness. "I didn't ask for all of this." I held her gaze. "You didn't have to. You got used to it. You built your life around it. And somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing it for what it was. A choice I made out of love, not an obligation." Her mouth opened like she was about to argue, but nothing came out. "You told me to respect your boundaries," I continued. "You told me I wasn't welcome in your home because your husband didn't want me there. You made it clear I'm not part of your life unless I'm paying for it, so I decided to respect my own boundaries too." She closed the folder slowly, her hands trembling slightly. "Dad, this isn't fair." "No," I said, my voice low but steady. "What's not fair is being treated like a burden while funding the roof over your head. What's not fair is being shut out of your life but expected to bankroll it." For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air heavy with the truth neither of us could avoid. I didn't need to raise my voice. The numbers in that folder said everything. And by the look on her face, she knew she couldn't argue with them. She stood frozen in the middle of my living room, still clutching the folder I'd handed her minutes ago. Her knuckles were white against the edges, and the papers inside were bent from the pressure of her grip. She looked at me like she was trying to read something softer in my face, something that might give her a way out of the reality written on those pages. I didn't move toward her. I didn't offer her a seat. This wasn't a conversation that needed comfort. It was one that needed clarity. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its sharpness, but there was still defiance in it. "So that's it? You're just cutting me off? After everything?" I took a slow, deliberate breath and let the quiet hang heavy between us. "No," I said evenly, "that's not it. I stepped closer, my tone calm but firm, every word measured. You didn't just exclude me from a dinner. You made it clear I wasn't family. And now you can see what life is like without me. Her eyes narrowed, and I saw her lips part as if to argue, but I didn't give her the space. Do you have any idea what it felt like to get that message from you? To read the words, "My husband doesn't want you there," as if I were a stranger. Do you know what it's like to be told you're not welcome at your own daughter's table? Then to overhear you later, laughing about it, calling me clingy, saying I'll always pay for things anyway? That wasn't just a mistake. That was you telling me exactly how you see me. Not a father, not family, just a wallet you think you can open whenever you please. She shifted her weight, her jaw tightening, but I kept going. I have spent decades making sure you had everything you needed. I've covered your bills when you couldn't. I've paid for your home, your utilities, your children's education, your vacations, your emergencies, without a second thought. I did it because you're my daughter, because I loved you, because your mother would have wanted me to. And in return, I get exclusion. I get disrespect. I get you and your husband deciding I'm only welcome when it suits you. Her fingers tightened around the folder. Dad, I didn't mean— Yes, I said, cutting in, my voice still calm but sharp as glass. You did. And even if you didn't mean every word, you meant the choice. You made your decision when you sent that text. Now, I'm making mine. From this day forward, you will live the life you and your husband can afford on your own. There will be no hidden contributions, no quiet rescues, no safety net. You wanted boundaries. You've got them. She stared at me for a long moment, her face a mixture of anger and something else, fear maybe, or the slow, creeping realization that I was serious. But she didn't argue again. She turned for the door, the folder still in her hands, and left without looking back. When the door closed, the house fell silent. But it wasn't the heavy silence of loss. It was the clean, final silence of a line drawn, one that would not be crossed again. It didn't take long for the ripple effects to become waves. Within 2 months, the house they'd once bragged about to anyone who would listen was up for sale. The for sale sign planted in the front yard was like a scar across the image they'd built for themselves. I drove past once, not to gloat, at least that's what I told myself, but to see for my own eyes that the life they'd lived on my back was truly crumbling. The manicured lawn had grown patchy. The flower beds that once overflowed with color were choked with weeds, and the shutters on the front windows were faded from neglect. The house sat on the market for weeks. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that they'd had to slash the price just to get offers. Selling under pressure doesn't get you a victory. It gets you a way out with barely enough left to land on your feet. The proceeds were just enough to cover their remaining mortgage and debts, but there was nothing left over for another grand purchase. They ended up renting a modest, cramped home in a less desirable part of town, one that didn't match the image they'd worked so hard to project. The kids were pulled from their private school before the end of the term. That, I'll admit, was the only part of this that gave me pause. I knew they'd lose opportunities they'd once had, but I also knew it wasn't my responsibility to make sure their parents lived within their means. My daughter had to walk into that school's office, sign the withdrawal papers, and explain to other parents, some of whom had been her friends, why her children wouldn't be returning. I'm sure the story she told was different from the truth, but appearances couldn't hide the reality from those who knew her situation. The luxuries fell away one by one. No more high-end dinners, no more designer clothes, no more weekend getaways. Their social media accounts went silent, and when they did post, It was filtered snapshots from public parks or homemade dinners passed off as cozy nights in. Their circle of friends shrank as invitations dried up. People who once enjoyed their company at parties and outings stopped calling when it became clear they could no longer keep up with the same lifestyle. Through all of it, I stayed silent. I didn't call to ask how they were managing, didn't offer a bridge loan, didn't swoop in with a last-minute rescue. Every choice they made now had to be within the limits of what they could afford without me propping them up. And the truth was, they couldn't afford much. I watched from a distance as they adjusted, or tried to. The shine was gone, replaced with the dull, necessary practicality of people who've been forced to live within their means for the first time in years. The safety net was gone, and the fall had left its mark. I made the appointment with my lawyer without hesitation. Wallace had already helped me restructure my assets and lock down the property and trusts she couldn't touch, so this was the natural final step. When I sat across from him in his office, he looked up from his desk and asked, "Are you certain you want to do this?" I didn't even blink. "Absolutely. I want her removed entirely from my will. Not a single cent, not a single item." We went through my current will line by line, crossing out her name wherever it appeared. In its place, I designated 2 beneficiaries, half to reputable charities I'd long supported, and the other half to be placed in trusts for my grandchildren directly. I made sure those trusts would bypass their parents completely, locked down so tight that not even the most creative lawyer could reroute the money. My grandchildren would get their inheritance when they came of age, free from the hands of a mother and father who'd squander it. Wallace was meticulous, ensuring every clause was airtight. "Once this is signed," he said, "she'll have no legal standing to contest it. Even if she tries, it will be thrown out before it reaches a courtroom." That was exactly what I wanted: finality. Signing the new documents felt different from any other step I'd taken in this process. Closing bank accounts, pulling my name from the mortgage, stopping payments, those had been about removing immediate access. This was about erasing the idea of future security, cutting the final lifeline she might have assumed would always be there. With every signature, the weight on my shoulders grew lighter. When the last page was signed, Wallace gathered the documents and placed them in a thick envelope. "This is ironclad," he said. "It will stand as long as you're alive, and it will hold after you're gone." I thanked him, slipped the envelope into my briefcase, and left his office feeling an unfamiliar kind of peace. A cold, clear satisfaction that the work was finally done. Back home, I placed the updated will in my safe, right next to Sarah's ring box. I rested my hand on the cool metal for a moment, thinking about how my wife would feel about all of this. I knew she wouldn't like the rift between me and our daughter, but I also knew she believed in fairness, in respect. She would understand that this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about protecting what we had built from being misused. From that day on, I carried a quiet certainty with me. My daughter had made it clear I wasn't part of her life unless I was paying for it. Now, I had made it equally clear. When my time came, she wouldn't benefit from my life's work in any way. That chapter was closed, and it would stay closed forever. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you walk slower without thinking about it. I took the familiar path between rows of markers until I reached the one that mattered most. Her stone was just as I remembered it, simple, dignified, with her name and the years that never felt like enough. I knelt down, brushing away a few dry leaves that had gathered at the base, and rested my hand against the cool granite. "Hi, Sarah," I said softly, my voice carrying only as far as I wanted it to. It's been a while, but I think you'd want to hear this. I took a deep breath and told her everything. I told her about the text from our daughter, the one that said I wasn't welcome at her dinner because her husband didn't want me there. I told her about overhearing the conversation where she called me clingy, said I'd always pay no matter what. I told her how it felt like losing her all over again, because that was the day I realized the values we'd worked so hard to teach our daughter had been buried under entitlement and pride. But then I told her what I'd done, how I'd met with Wallace, shut down every account, pulled my name from the mortgage, stopped paying the bills they'd relied on for years, how I'd sold the car from under them, cut off the tuition payments, and locked away every asset in trusts they couldn't touch, how I'd sat across from our daughter in the living room and told her, plain as day, that she wasn't family to me anymore if she only saw me as a paycheck. I told her about the new will, how I'd removed our daughter entirely, leaving everything instead to charities we both believed in and to our grandchildren directly, ensuring that the next generation would have a chance without being poisoned by the same attitudes that had taken root in their parents. As I spoke, I found myself tracing the letters of her name with my fingertips. I promised you, I said quietly, back when you were sick, I told you I'd protect her. Make sure she had what she needed. I've kept that promise for years, Sarah. But protecting her doesn't mean enabling her to throw away the values we raised her with. It doesn't mean letting her shut me out and still live on my back. A light breeze stirred the branches overhead, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting it pass over me. I've done what I had to do. It wasn't easy, but it was right. I've made sure everything we built will go to good hands. You don't have to worry anymore. I stayed there a while longer, just sitting with her in the quiet. And for the first time in months, I felt something lift, a weight I'd been carrying since that first cold text. I stood, touched the top of her stone one last time, and walked away knowing I'd done exactly what she would have wanted. I stood on my porch that evening, the sky fading into deep blue, the last light of day glinting off the metal of the key ring in my hand. It was quiet, peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. The chaos, the constant demands, the subtle guilt trips and manipulations, all of it had gone silent. They weren't calling anymore, not since the reality had settled in. And in that stillness, I realized just how much space their constant need had taken up in my life. For years, I had been the silent force holding their world together. They thought the mortgage just worked itself out, that the lights stayed on because bills paid themselves, that the kids' school never had to send reminders because tuition simply appeared. But none of that happened by magic. It happened because I was there, quietly, consistently, without fail. And I never once asked for thanks. I thought being a father meant giving until you had nothing left, and maybe for a long time it did. But there's a difference between giving and being used. When they decided I wasn't welcome, not at their dinner table, not in their home, not even in their lives except as a source of money, they crossed a line they didn't think I'd defend. They thought my love for my daughter would keep me in place, paying, providing, even as they pushed me further away. They underestimated me. They always had. I'd been careful, methodical. I dismantled their safety net without a single warning, pulled my name and my money from every corner of their lives, and locked away every asset they might have counted on in the future. I didn't do it in anger. I did it with the same precision I once used to build that net in the first place. The difference was, this time, the work was for me. They'd sold the house, pulled the kids from private school, and shed the luxuries they'd flaunted for so long. Their image was gone, and I hadn't lifted a finger to help them rebuild it. That wasn't my job anymore. I stepped back inside, set the keys on the table, and glanced at the folder that still sat on my desk. The one with every payment, every bill, every deposit I'd ever made for them. It was a reminder, not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd reclaimed. My time, my peace, my self-respect. I thought about Sarah, about the conversations we used to have when our daughter was young. She always said, "One day, you'll have to let her stand on her own." I guess that day had finally come. I closed the door against the cool night air, turned off the porch light, and said it out loud, just for me. They thought I'd keep paying no matter what, but they forgot. I was the one holding the purse strings. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.